Katie.
Hello.
Katie Wadoody
Katie
Doots.
Stooty Doots.
Yeah. That was your nickname growing up.
Yes.
Katie Wadoody Doots. I don't know where that
Do
came
you
from.
remember that story at all of when I was a baby and I almost suffocated?
Oh, kind of.
You forgot about it.
Well, yeah, I forgot. But Mom went. She didn't sleep. Matter of fact, I remember we bought a thing that was like a plastic, like an air mattress.
Mm-hmm.
It had little ridges that were made out of air, and it was designed so that it would set an alarm if you didn't move,
Oh, okay.
and you slept on that. She bought one of those because otherwise she was trying to stay awake all night to make sure you were breathing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she went. She really was worried, but I don't remember why.
Well, she said the spirit woke her up and she's like, go check on the baby.
That's right. That's right.
And she said it happened 2 or 3 other times until you finally got up and went.
Yeah. But then she couldn't sleep, and so yeah.
Should we start now?
Yeah, you guys are good to
Should
go.
we introduce ourselves?
Yeah.
I'm Katie DeVincent.
I'm Wayne DeVincent.
This is my pappy.
Hi. I was born June 10th, 1951 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I remember my mom said when she felt the labor pains that she was in Yale University in New Haven, which is kind of close to Fairfield, which is where we grew up. But I was born in Bridgeport Hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital in Connecticut. And we were pretty, for where we lived, we weren't that well off. My dad only had, I think, an 8th grade education. So he never ever had a good job. And interestingly, both my mom and dad were at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. My dad was in the Army and my mom lived in Pearl City. She actually lived on the military base, and so the planes were attacking really her house, and pretty scary times. They kind of knew each other but didn't get married till after the war. But then they eventually came back. My older brother Bobby was
Well, tell the story about how they met.
Well, they met, this is kind of funny, they met my mom was a part-time waitress in a little restaurant, and she didn't find this out till almost when she died, but my dad and all the other GIs would go in there, and she said she could never figure out why the GIs were always so thirsty. She said they always wanted water and just water. And my dad finally told her, just really at the end of her life, towards the end, he says, "You dumb bunny," he says, "we were asking for water because we couldn't afford to order anything off the menu, and the water was free." He says, "We were throwing water in the plants, throwing it out the window just to get the waitresses to come by." So he said that's what they were doing. But anyway, they got married after the war, and my dad deployed, what do you call it when you're done, redeployed, after, and went to California. And he worked my mom and dad worked my dad was a butler and she was the cook and kind of the house cleaner. And they worked for a guy named Sonny Tufts, who was an A-list movie star back in Hollywood. And they stayed there for just a year or so. And eventually my dad wanted to come back to Connecticut, which is where he was from. And I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a year after my brother was born. Interestingly, I don't know if you knew this, but my mom said because when my brother Bobby was born, there was complications, and so they had to take him C-section.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
And then she was told by the doctor, because she got pregnant right away with me, and they said, "You better abort him because it could kill you." And she goes, "No, I can't do that." And so they were worried because they said, "Well, the stitches may not even be fully healed up." Anyway, she said she was glad that she didn't. But
Wait, would it have been with you?
yeah, I would have been
Okay.
aborted. So there was a real good chance I wasn't going to be here. And that way you wouldn't be here either.
Wow.
As they say in Back to the Future, the movie, erased from existence. So anyway, and also in my birth, I remember my mom said they used forceps, and that's why I got, if you look when I talk, I've got, that came from the guy grabbing my jaw or something.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he just kind of pulled on it when I was little.
Now you got that crooked smile.
Yeah, like, who's that? Sylvester Stallone,
Yeah.
that actor.
Maybe
But-
the same thing happened to him.
Yeah. Anyway, so we came back to Connecticut, and my dad, when he first came back, he just rented a place. It was on Bronson Road, and we lived right across the street from these people called the Bronsons, and they owned all of the land. And I remember we were good friends with them, but they got that land right from the King of England. It was a land grant.
Oh, wow.
And we had a little log cabin in there that was on the back of the property that we owned that went back to like colonial or pre-colonial time. It was really old. And I remember that we'd play in it, but we couldn't play very long because it was like humid and there were bugs and spiders and stuff. We could never play inside of it very much. But back in those days, Davy Crockett was famous in Disneyland. And we always wanted to be Davy Crockett and live in a log cabin. And the house backed up to the Mill River. And that Mill River was kind of cool too because right next to us there was an old, huge barn, a big red barn. And in colonial times, what they would do for ice, they didn't have refrigerators. They would go to the Mill River, saw out big chunks of ice, put it in hay in that big barn, and then sell the ice all year long in the summer. And so we lived right next door to that, right next to the river. And in Fairfield, where we grew up, there were a lot of houses that were colonial. A lot of them had numbers like 1799, and some of them were pre-colonial, pre-revolutionary, some were revolutionary. And some of the houses had Washington slept here signs. Those were the coolest ones. That meant George Washington actually spent the night in one of the houses. And I remember in our hometown there was kind of a few of them.
Oh, well, that's cool.
And the main road there was called the Boston Post Road, U.S. Route 1. It went from Boston to Washington, D.C., and it's like State Street here, but it was the main road. But back then it was the first toll road in the United States. And my dad grew up in Fairfield. On another section, he lived on Berwick Avenue. His home got destroyed when Route 95, his New England Thruway, went through. But I was able to go back and look at his house, and I felt like I was directed by the spirit. I was driving along, going back, and my brother Bob, I said, Bobby, I'm going back to Connecticut. It was for my 40th class reunion.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you want? What do you want? What should I see? And he says, go to Tops. Tops is like, it was like Kmart. But that's where we bought our shoes. We bought everything there. And it was kind of a crappy place, but that's where we shopped. And I was looking for Tops. I couldn't quite remember what it was. And I felt something, and I saw Berwick Avenue. I said, oh, that's where Dad grew up. And I never thought to look for it because I knew his house wasn't there. He said his house got destroyed. But I went there, and I looked at the numbers. It was 48 Berwick Avenue. And I got to all the numbers, and it went right to where his house would have been. And that's where the freeway was. But I could see, and it's the same from 100 years ago, the 1920s. I could see exactly what it was like where he grew up. That was kind of fun.
Oh, that's cool.
And I felt like my dad had passed away, but I felt
Yeah.
like he was telling me, no, go look at this.
Oh, that's cool.
Because this looks just like it was when I was growing up. That was fun. Anyway, my dad worked for a company called Bullard's at first, and he was a crane operator. And those are these big, huge trolleys that they're steel beams, and they did what was called tool and die machinery. They actually made out of metal. They would cut things and make machinery. And he moved those heavy things with these overhead cranes, and he did that. I remember as a kid, every Friday we'd get paid in cash in an envelope, and we'd drive up to a pay station, and he'd get his money in an envelope in cash. And he and everybody else in our neighborhood that worked there, it seemed like everybody worked there, would usually spend it on beer. It was like Friday night, and then everybody sat around on the porches. And I remember, especially in the summer, it was really, really hot in Connecticut. It's hot and humid back there, and the humidity gets to you. But they would sit around drinking beers, and kids would play. We lived in after Bronson Road. My mom and dad bought a duplex, and it was called the Village on Garden Drive, and Melville Village, that was the name of the place. And it was called Projects, which is not a good thing. I mean, it was pretty
It's
poor.
the same thing as they call it now.
Do they? Yeah. And so somebody said, where do you live? And you said, well, I live in the projects. And all these other people around us are pretty well off. Mostly Jewish people and, pretty well off. And so I always felt different economically. And then I felt different because Well, my dad was Italian, or his dad immigrated right from Italy in 1895. He was born in 1891. He immigrated actually left in December of 1895, arrived in January of 1896 in Ellis Island, and they settled in Boston. And I could tell that his dad joined, I believe it's his oldest brother. It could have been his dad. I can't find the gravesite of who it was, but said he started working. So my dad's dad was, oh gosh, what's his name now? I forgot. Anyway, he worked for a guy named Frank. And Francesco is his father's name. And I think that's the American version. And they had a tradition of naming their first child after their dad. So I'm assuming it's his older brother. And they were tailors together in downtown Boston. They, I guess Italians maybe knew how to be clothiers, but they didn't stay at that very long. So I don't think the business was very successful. Eventually, my dad, it turns out he was actually raised by his father, Joseph de Vincent, but his mom had my dad when she was only 14 years old, which means she was pregnant when she was 13.
Oh.
And yeah, and that made it really tough. When she finally got married, it turns out my dad was the product of, Joseph de Vincent, my dad's father, was a World War I doughboy. That's what they called him. Now in World War II they called them GIs, but he was a soldier in World War I, was in France, was in the army, and drove an ambulance. But after the war, my dad's mom's brother was killed, and Joseph de Vincent was like his best friend, so he came over to visit the family to talk to him about Grandma's brother who had died in the war. And so, I don't know what happened, but somehow she wound up pregnant, and eventually she went to get married. And when she went to get married, she just brought my dad from. They lived in Springfield, Massachusetts. They went down to Fairfield, Connecticut, which is where Joseph de Vincent lived, and he was married, had a wife and a daughter. And they said to Joseph de Vincent, and I'm sure it was a shock, said, "Here you go, take him." And to my dad's way of thinking, that was like, "Well, Mom, what are you doing? I'm living in a stranger's house." And
How old do you think he was?
I'm guessing, I'm trying to look at they only do censuses every 10 years, so I'm guessing he was 6 to 8 years old, something like that. My dad had a cool birthday. He was born 2/22 of 22, so February 22nd. But it was traumatic for him because
Mom just dumps him off at this stranger's house.
yeah, and my dad didn't tell me or my mom or anybody about this experience till, it was like a week or two before he died, and he finally said, this is his recollection. And so he never said anything. And anytime I asked him about his genealogy, he would swear and say, why do you need to know that? You don't, aren't I good enough? I feel bad now. And I kind of judged my dad kind of harshly too, because he kind of was an alcoholic. He growing up, he was actually pretty good. He just drank beer for most of his life. But then in high school, he somehow got hooked on vodka. And I don't remember in high school him ever eating. He just drank vodka from the minute he got up. And I guess you can live on vodka. He put it in a can of Coke, and that's all he ever did was drink vodka with Coke. And what made it worse is he was a truck driver.
Oh no!
Yeah, he drove a delivery truck for the Bridgeport Post, which was one of the largest newspapers in the country. And he was, I think, circulation manager.
So he was a high-functioning alcoholic.
Yeah, but some guys are happy drunks and some guys are kind of mean drunks, and he kind of developed into a mean drunk after he graduated to vodka. He was fine before that. And I remember he would always, Bobby and Gary and he would take us camping once a year. He had 1 week, 5 days off. This is when he worked at a gas station most of the time up until high school. It was in high school when he got this other job at the Bridgeport Post. But he would take us to upstate New York. He would take us the last week of school, which we like getting out of school early. And we'd always go up to upstate New York in a place called Louis Lake. And it was by Lake George. And we would see Lake Champlain, and there was Fort Crown Point, a lot of the colonial sites. And we'd be in these campsites, and there'd be nobody else there. And there were chipmunks that were there, and they always were looking for food. And when we were there, then they would come and sit on our table looking for scraps of bread or whatever. And we asked, my dad asked the park ranger, he says, can we capture one of these and keep them? They said, oh yeah,
Nuisance.
they're nuisance for us. So we had pet hamsters. I mean,
Squirrels?
Chipmunks.
Oh, chipmunks.
And I remember one chipmunk, once we had two chipmunks. It was Chipper, and I don't remember what the other name was. Chipper was his name. But they would get up at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and they'd run on the little hamster exercise wheel. And they'd make so much noise because you hear it, and it got squeaky, and the cage would rattle. So my dad he finally took it out. It was like clipped on the metal things. He just took it off and just set it down in the cage. And so then the hamsters were in it like, why doesn't this work anymore? And so what they finally did is they started running around this thing.
Funny.
And they were running circles, and now it was banging against the cage. And so my dad took the whole wheel out. And next thing you know, they were just doing flips. The only exercise was to just go around, and so these chipmunks would do flips all the time. And anyway, they were really friendly, and they loved peanut butter. They would come and just always come to peanut butter. But my dad loved the little chipmunks. He loved little animals. And if you remember, I don't know if you remember he had Orville, the little pet rabbit. Eventually, when my dad retired, when we came out from Connecticut to here, my dad was the guard that would come in to let everybody into the base, and he'd check credentials or whatever. And he had that job for 10 years or so. I think he worked till he was 70. He was still on the squat, what do you call it, SWAT team. He had to retire because they said he jumped off a one-story building with his M16 rifle and hurt his back and knee. But that's as a 70-year-old. That's my age. Actually, that's 2 more years older than I am. I can't believe he was still doing that. But
So when did he become a good cook and like stop drinking as much?
oh,
Because that's what I remember.
That's a good question.
Like,
Anyway, let me finish this one. Anyway, he had a pet rabbit out there. There wasn't a lot of times people didn't come. It's in the middle of the desert, so he fed these rabbits, and he eventually brought Orville home. And I remember when he passed, your mom, Dad was heartbroken because he loved little animals, the little furry creatures.
yeah.
Susan made a little wooden cross that said, "Here lies Orville. He was a good rabbit." Do you remember that at all?
No.
We had a burial ceremony just north of the home there,
Barely,
Bobby's home.
maybe.
It was fun. Anyway, my dad, I asked him, I said, "Dad, when did you start to cook?" He says, well, so also to kind of go back on my dad thing, so when he got dumped off, his stepmom was pretty mean to him. Now, I can understand why now, but I didn't at the time. I just thought, well, that happens. He just says, I was adopted, that's all you need to know. But now I know that was his real dad, and I think the stepmother always was upset with him. And so, and probably always reminded him that my grandpa had done that. And so by the time he was 14, he started running away from home, and he started smoking when he was 14 and maybe drinking a little bit even then. But by the time he was 16, he left home for good. He joined the CCC, which stands for Community Conservation Corps, and he wound up in Estes Park, Colorado, planting pine trees. And then when he turned 18, he joined or 17, I think, he joined the Army, and he wound up in Hawaii. He said, I could go in. I said, how'd you pick Hawaii? And he says, well, I saw the movie theater. Back then, you'd pay a nickel. You get into the movie theaters, and they go all day long. They'd have cartoons. They'd have newsreels. That was the TV of the day, and features. And you could stay in as long as you wanted, for your nickel. But anyway, let's see. I forgot where I was in my story.
Why'd you pick Hawaii?
Oh, yeah. He picked Hawaii because he says, well, it seemed like nice. I'd never been there. So, and I'll tell you maybe some more stories about that. But you had asked, when he started cooking. So he was running away from home when he was 14 and pretty much gone by 16. But he said his first job, I think it was Stratford. Again, the Boston Post Road there, right after World War II. This was interesting too, but especially in that time, there's a lot of things where they would take railroad cars. So his dad was a railroad conductor, went from Bridgeport to New Haven, and just a rail line. He wasn't a conductor. He just was he was a conductor. He wasn't an engineer, but he was on trains. And so my dad got a job in a dining car. Now, what they would do, and those are still, you see them today, like wingers, they look like the old-fashioned dining cars. Back then, they would take a train, a dining car, take it out, put it on the side of the road, and people would have a little hamburger stand and they would cook food. And these dining cars were popular along the road. And back then, the roads, we didn't have the freeway system. It took the night, right after World War II, they started doing freeway systems, and then people would travel, like Route 66 became famous. But these dining cars is where people would eat. They didn't have McDonald's back then. And so my dad, his first job was in a dining car. And he said, the guy said to him, he said, okay, I want you to heat up this can of peas. You know, so,
Well, I think you told me this.
yeah, and back then, also they had these can openers that you had to open, and now they're made out of aluminum. Back then they were a little heavy duty, but so the guy left, or didn't, and he says, I didn't know what to do with it. So he says, I took the can of peas, I put it in the oven, and turned the oven on. Well, it exploded. And I said, well, what happened? He says, I took off out of there. I said, did you ever go back? He goes, no. I said, he says, no, I was. So that's his first. I asked him about his first adventure cooking, and it was the exploding can of peas.
That's funny.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. But I think he always liked to cook and always tried to cook. And I remember growing up, and even when he drank and didn't eat anything, he always made these elaborate meals. And so when I was 9 years old, they finally started a branch of we belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in Bridgeport, they started a branch called the Bridgeport branch.
Did Grandpa ever join the church or no?
Not till after I graduated from college, Susan and I were married. I had to get my mom out of there because he was starting to get sort of violent and threatening her. And so, anyway, she came out, and then he came out and joined the church. It was kind of funny how we joined the church. He had gone to church for a while, had seen Spencer Kimball. So Andy Kimball, Spencer Kimball's son, worked for General Electric, which was headquartered in Fairfield, Connecticut. And so one day the prophet of the church shows up in the church, and my mom made him come. And he's sitting in the audience, and he's trying not to look directly at the prophet, Mom said, finally he looked up, and the prophet looked at him, and she asked my dad, she said, what do you think? He says, I know you looked at him. I know the prophet looked at you. What did you think? And my dad says, he had that look like, I'm going to get you. You're going to join us. Anyway, they laughed about that. It was pretty funny. But my dad wanted to join, but I think he had a hard time giving up smoking and drinking. And when you do it your whole life, it's pretty tough. And so when my mom finally left him and came out, my dad stayed back. He agreed one time. He got in a couple of car wrecks, and he agreed to. My mom said, "Bob, we're gonna lose everything because the house, everything, because you're gonna kill somebody. You can't drink and drive, and you got to stop." And he kept promising. He kept not doing it, and then he got frustrated. My mom went to AAA meetings. She wanted me to go to. That's the Alcoholics Anonymous Association, and I didn't want to go. I was too embarrassed. But she'd go, and she said she understood that he would get mean because it's his own sense of frustration of he didn't feel good about himself and kind of like, why can't I be stronger? Because back in those days, you pretty much were a man, you manned up, and where he couldn't solve that, I think it was really hard on him. So finally, my mom got the house signed over to him, and she said, okay, but and I think he had one more episode, and so she said, I'm leaving, and she came back to Connecticut, or came from Connecticut. I remember I drove up, I bought a pickup truck, a little Ford F-1500, F-150 truck. I said, okay, Mom, anything you fit in that truck we could take, anything else we're going to throw away. And she couldn't make it. She just cried and cried and cried. We were thrown away. She kept everything. I mean,
Yeah, she is a hoarder.
she was a hoarder. We cleaned out the whole attic. We just threw everything away. And I wish I had some of those old records now. But anyway, we drove out, and then 2 or 3 months later, he sobered up and came out. And he told the story. He said he decided, I think, like in Job, where it says after everything, not Job, the prodigal son, where he said he went and spent all of his inheritance. And one day, the word was he came to himself. I think my dad came to himself and said, okay, this is no good. My whole family's out there. Bobby moved out. I moved out there. Gary was in the Marines, and he eventually, after the Marines came in, he moved out there. So we're all out here. But anyway, my dad decided he'd come out, and he drove a car oh man, I think it was a 1968 Buick Electra. He called it Magic Marvel because it was an 8-cylinder, but maybe only 6 cylinders worked on the car. And the only way to keep the car running was to put this, what was called Magic Marvel Mystery Oil. It was really, it's like honey. It was really thick stuff that kept a worn engine that was all worn out, that would keep it running. And he put as much Magic Marvel Mystery Oil in it as he did gasoline. But somehow he drove that whole car across the U.S. and he shows up, and when he gets to there, he kind of comes in the front room and collapses. And by that time, Mom had sold the duplex and had enough money to pay cash for the house and had cash in the bank. So that new house that Uncle Bobby lives in was all paid for. And my dad came out and tried to quit everything, smoking, drinking, cold turkey. And he had, the DTs and whatever. And turns out later we found out, the doctor said, well, you've had several heart attacks. He goes, no. And my mom said, remember when I tried to get you to go to the doctor and you said, no, just hold my hand, I'll be okay, I'll get through it. He was having heart attacks, among other things. And so it was pretty tough. But he wanted to, and everything was great. For the next 10 years, he worked at the Twill Army till he fell and hurt his back and hurt his knee. And he self-medicated he started drinking again after that because he was still in a lot of pain. I don't think his pain management was very good. And he wanted to stop. But, I forgot, he joined the church, but before he came out, he came out from Connecticut as a member of the church. That's when he joined. But he said he woke up the missionaries. He said it was 2 o'clock in the morning. He says, I want to join the church. And they were like rubbing their eyes like, oh, okay, well, we got to give you some lessons and stuff. He goes, screw the lessons. He said, I've had it for years. He says, I need to get baptized. I got to go get my wife. And so somehow he talked him into baptizing him, and then he came out. So that was pretty fun. I can just imagine, that's the story. I can imagine the elders were like, what the? Anyway, so he came out, and things were really pretty good while he was out here because he was working hard. He worked at the Army. He got a job at the Twill Army Depot, and they bridged his time from when he was in World War I. I think he had 7 years that he put in with the Army because he was about due to get out of the Army when Pearl Harbor hit, and he finished the war. And so they bridged that time with this Twill Army Depot time. And so he actually had a fairly decent retirement, and he had all his medical paid for. And so he and Mom were pretty happy. And actually they left us quite a few things. Bobby, Gary, and I have, my dad, when he was working at the gas station, back then, 4-ply tires were brand new. 4-ply meaning that you had 1, 2, 3, 4 plies. 2-ply were more normal. But everybody had flats all the time. I mean, if you think about it, if you had a balloon, that's like a 1-ply tire. 2-ply isn't much better. 4-ply still, people were getting flats all the time, and they'd come in and he'd have to fix the flat. He'd jack it up and do it. And but he'd get a little tip. And all of his tips, and sometimes even just pumping gas. Back in those days, you didn't pump your own gas. The gas station guy did it. And they always checked oil because cars in those days used oil like crazy. So about every 2 or 3 gas tank fulls, they thought the oil would lubricate all the pistons going up and down, and they don't make them tight like they do today. Today they're precision. Back then, used a lot of oil. But he got tips. He saved all of his tips. That was his way that he saved money. And all of it back then was silver. And so today a quarter's worth like $40, a 25-cent piece. And he saved all of that. And Bobby, Gary, and I, Bobby spent a little bit of it, but Gary and I, to me, that's precious money. And it really said how hard he worked and how disciplined he was to not spend that money. Even when he was an alcoholic or whatever, he didn't dip into that. He was disciplined in other ways. But so when he had his relapse after 10 years, I see it as the Lord saw fit to give him a stroke. And then he couldn't drive and he couldn't get around, and nobody would buy him his smokes and nobody would buy him his booze. And so he stopped drinking again, which was kind of cool. And he got back into church being faithful, coming, because he kind of left after he kind of had a relapse. And I know he felt bad, but I think the Lord was merciful and knew what his heart was like. And when I was growing up, when I made my mom move out and stay away from him, I thought it was bad news. I was not proud of him. I didn't think much of him. And now that I know about his background, I didn't know that till just recent, just a few, like 10 years ago. Now I understand why his stepmom, and I have compassion for her too. I understand why she was kind of mean to my dad. And I also think my dad always took us on vacations. He was loving. And I remember when we lived on Bronson Road, he would come in. He drove a Harley Davidson for his main vehicle. He was an MP during World War II too. He actually, when he first got to Hawaii, he was the driver, and there was what they call a belly gun, a 50 caliber machine gun in the belly of the tank. But he said, when the war broke out, he says, I'm not doing that. He says, you can't see anything. Anybody could just run up and throw a grenade or shoot you. You have no idea. You're blind. And he says, those things always broke down. And he says, if you popped your head out, you'd get shot. So he became an MP. He drove a Harley Davidson, and he drove one for his whole life. I mean, even at the end, my brother Gary bought him one that was like his vintage, but a trike, so that
I remember
with a
that
sidecar.
trike.
Yeah.
I remember he took me on a trip on that.
Did he? Yeah. And so he loved driving around in that motorcycle and that's what he drove, even in high school. That's his main vehicle. Even in the winter when it snowed. I mean, there's horrible snowstorms, and he would drive his Harley Davidson. I mean, he had a car, but he liked the Harley Davidson. And by the way, my dad was really physically really, really strong. And not only did he have, like when he worked at the newspaper, he was a bouncer there was a local, it's like a McDonald's, but it was called the Duchess. And in Fairfield, our little we only had 50,000
They
people.
have bouncers at McDonald's?
They did, because the Duchess was right next to a McDonald's in Fairfield. And they were like, the two high schools had rival, like their hangouts. They wouldn't let other kids from the same high school. So in our town, even though there's only 50,000 people, Bobby, Gary, and I went to Andrew Ward High School. My dad said Roger Ludlow was this high school when he was growing up, but I don't think he got. I think he maybe had 1 year of high school, but because of the two high schools in the one town, they were always having fights. So I hired my dad to just sit there, and he would sit there on a Harley Davidson and joke with it. He knew more kids than I did. Everybody knew him, and he was friendly with everybody. And but he was the bouncer, and if you didn't do what he said, he'd hit you. I mean, he's a pretty strong guy.
Tell me about your childhood, like the house you grew up in. And
Well, so as we had that rental house on Bronson Road for a few years when we were really little, and then and I remember once my dad tried to raise a cow and some chickens. The chickens we kept, we got fresh eggs from that, but the cow was a little calf, and that was too much work, and that didn't last very long. And then we finally got to move to a house that was ours, and we were excited. So it was on 44 Garden Drive in Fairfield, other end of town. But
how old were you when you moved into the house?
we were little. I mean, I was still in elementary school. So I went to Stratfield Elementary School, and that's when we moved in. So I'm guessing I was, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 in that range. But we moved to the house, and it was fun being there. And it was all brick. And so on our side of the duplex, so we were able to rent out one side. And I think it cost them $10,000, $11,000 for that duplex for 2 houses. And they could rent out the other side, which really helped, and it helped pay for the house. And that was our main, and my mom said, if we don't buy this, she really, really pushed. My dad said, I don't know if I want to buy that. I don't want to live in a duplex. I want a real house, kind of. My mom said, you'd be a fool if we don't do it. I'm glad they did it. But as you walked into that house, again, this is the 1950s, to the left, as you went into this porch, it was a wooden porch, there was a little shed, and it was a coal bin. So the whole back opened up, and there was a little door in the front that opened right next to the front door. You would get coal. And the coal was used because there was a potbelly stove in the kitchen. And it was an old-fashioned potbelly stove that had a pipe that went out. And that heated, you cooked on it, it heated the steam that there were radiators throughout the house. That's what heated the house in the summer or in the winter. And what else? Oh, and the hot water for the shower was all through that potbelly stove. There was a kitchen sink, but it didn't have no cabinets. A couple of shelves, empty shelves, and we always had like a rag or a piece of cloth to hide the sinks. But I mean, it never really looked great. We had a refrigerator that I remember said cold spot on it, and they always called it an ice box. And the reason is, in the olden days, before electricity, they would get a piece of ice and put it in a container, and that would be like the refrigerator, but they called it an ice box, and we called it an ice box growing up, not a refrigerator.
Did you share a room with your brothers? Or?
Yeah, so there were two rooms there were two rooms, one upstairs. There was a sort of a smaller one that had and one bathroom. And my mom and dad slept in the smaller one. Bobby, Gary, and I were in another one. We had bunk beds and another bed. One dresser with 3 drawers. We each had a drawer, and a closet that was maybe that wide that we could hang some shirts in.
And you guys always rotated clothes, so it looked like you had more clothes.
Yeah, once a year we got new shoes, and once a year we got one shirt. We got an outfit, shoes, socks, pants, shirt. That was once a year. And so we always were careful with our shoes so that we wouldn't, ruin them. And but they pretty much lasted every year. But Bobby and I were exactly the same size, so we would share stuff, not only from prior years, but even the new stuff we were sharing. He was really good about sharing. My older brother, and I realize now he was pretty nice of him, because nobody likes, how maybe Olivia and Maya, or just
they don't like to share clothes.
well, yeah, and it's like, let me have my own friends, But Bobby was always nice and always inviting, and he looked out for me. And Bobby was really strong growing up, believe it or not. I remember in 6th grade, he set the record for the number of, he found out with the school record, and he just beat it by 1. And
For the
you could-
pull-ups?
Yeah, you could tell he could have done more.
And you set the school record for limbo? Is that right?
Oh, that was 6th grade, yeah. Back then they had a thing called limbo. I don't know if you know what that is, but you put a stick.
Yeah, I know what the limbo is.
But I could stand and literally go back and touch the back of my head and stand back up again.
That's how Olivia got her flexibility.
It could be, at least I could do that. And I could actually even bend you'd think this would be the limiting factor, but I could actually bend them so that it could go even less than
Oh, see, she did get that from you.
I don't know. Well, I was pretty cool. I had notoriety in 6th grade, and when you're never feeling really confident.
Did you feel like judged a lot from your ethnicity?
Oh, yeah, that was the worst part. So we always kind of kept quiet about being Japanese, but they kind of knew, even though we had an Italian last name, they kind of knew. And then I remember once my mom's sister Rose, you know Aunt Rose, she was beautiful, by the way. Aunt Rose would come, and then their mom, Obachan, my grandmother, would come from Hawaii to visit. And when they would come, after they flew over here, obviously they brought their luggage, and they would go to Chinatown in New York City, and they'd buy us Chinese stuff because that's as close to. And I remember one year they came, they brought us these jackets that we were supposed to wear to school, and they were like made out of silk. And my brother Bobby said it's like having the rising sun on the back of your back. We were going to get killed. And so we would go to school. We'd hide our jackets in the woods, and then we'd go to school without the jackets, even though it was cold, because we didn't want to get beat up. He said it was like saying, having a kick me sign on it.
Yeah.
But I also remember she bought little bird cages and all these little things from Chinatown. That was fun, but they were really nice. Interestingly, our next door neighbor, Johnny Tag and Elva Tag, we still see and keep in contact with, but Johnny told me, he says, I remember your aunt. He said, I thought she was the most beautiful lady in the world. And this is after 50 years of being there and having seen him. That's like the first thing he mentioned. He remembered Aunt Rose, which I found sort of surprising. That's kind of what he remembered. And Elva remembered my mom being really nice to her, I guess. And I didn't know the story, so Elva told me the story. She said, what my dad would do, because it was hot and we had no air conditioning. Nobody did. But he always had an old canvas tent set up, and we could sleep outside, and somehow it was cooler. Mm-hmm. And, I meant that in not only temperature-wise, but it was more fun.
Yeah.
It was cooler to sleep out there. And Elva was always asking my mom if she could sleep out here with the boys, and she goes, no, you can't sleep out here with the boys, And so finally, and she was disappointed. She said one day, my mom said, oh, listen, you want to sleep over? I'll sleep out there with you. And so Elva said that my mom and she made some food or whatever, but they slept out in the tent together so that Elva could.
Because she was your age?
Yeah, she was exactly Bobby's. So she's a year older than me. She's Bobby's age, but we were little. She's probably 8 or 9 years old, but she remembered the kindness of my mom to let her sleep out in the tent in the backyard because the boys always got to do it. Johnny
Yeah.
slept, and we always, Billy, there was always a bunch of boys sleeping in the tent, but the girls, and she could never do it. So anyway, she did that once, and she also remembered my mom was a gardener. My mom loved to garden, and I think I probably got that from her.
Yeah.
We grew a lot of vegetables, and yeah, I always did that. I also have to say that potbelly stove one day, I think it was around 1960, my dad took out the potbelly stove and we put in a gas furnace, a water heater and a furnace in the basement. And he dug out the basement by hand. He was taking buckets, taking them out, throwing them out, and we were filling up the backyard. And that got rid of the thing. We got a regular stove, but the house was never nice. And then I think I was a junior in high school. I took down all of the shelves and bought prefab cabinets.
So you guys lived there for a long time.
Oh yeah, that's pretty much everything that we had. But I made the kitchen nice. I put all cabinets, so now we had doors or whatever. But that was just before we left. We did all of that, and then I put plastic shutters on the window so that it wasn't just plain. It didn't look quite as plain. But I never wanted anybody to come see our house. But I remember Susan. I met her when she was 12 at church. I was a deacon and I was passing the sacrament, and I remember she came in for the first time. They came because of the 1964 World's Fair.
Oh, yeah.
And they saw Man's Search for Happiness, joined the church. And when we went to high school, the seminary teacher, Brother Heaps, would drive his car and pick up all the kids, and we'd go to the chapel, which was 10 minutes from my house, 20 minutes from Mom's house in Westport, but we'd go all the way to Trumbull. By the time our first church was a little old, an old smelly house in Clinton Avenue in Bridgeport. Then they built a new chapel. What year was that? I think 1960. I don't know. 62. We built the chapel, but anyway, we would drive there for seminary and then drive back. So Mom knew where I lived, and I never wanted her to go in the house. And you can imagine. Now I realize I was always like embarrassed, like what? Because there just wasn't room for stuff. We had more coats than we had closets. We had more everything. There was no room. There were 3 boys in one little room, and I said I had one drawer for everything. So most of the stuff wound up on the floor. It just did. But I was always embarrassed. I go to other people's house, like Randy Zabo, my neighbor. He had his own room, and it was beautiful. It was nice, and you watched Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons or whatever, and you knew how everybody lived because of TV, and I knew we weren't there, So it was just embarrassing. And we had a saying: if anybody was coming in the house, we go, "They're here." That's all we had to say was "they're here." That meant take everything, throw the clothes under the seats, stuff in the closet or whatever, but just at least clean up the living room. And all we said is "they're here." We all knew what that meant. And
They're here, clean up.
yeah, I also remember one other last thing. When our relatives, so my dad's sister, so his mom remarried, and she had kids, and so those were my dad's half brothers and sisters. So I had a brother Frank and a sister,
Mary?
No, Celine. No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh crap! I can't think. Anyway,
Sicily? No.
it
Was it
was
Sicily?
no. It's like Celine. Anyway, she married a lawyer, and they were pretty well off. They had a swimming pool, and they had a library that I thought was fake. And now I realize that most of it were law books, and then other books. But he had a whole room that looked like as big as our high school. At least that's what I thought in my mind when I was a little kid. But we'd love going over there. But whenever we went there, or they came to our house on occasion, I remember my eyes were always itchy. It felt like I just got out of a swimming pool, like chlorine. I realized it was all the smoke, because everybody smoked, and the eyes really bothered me. But I couldn't figure it out at the time. I didn't know why that was happening. But now I know it's just because everybody was smoking. But anyway, yeah, that's it.
I think that's pretty good. How long we've been going here?
Come on.
Come on!
Well,
Been going for 45 minutes. So you have, if you want, you can stop now if you want, or you still have 37 minutes on timeline.
Do you want to talk about anything else?
yeah, let's talk about
You
Mom.
want to talk about when you met Mom?
Yeah, our first date was a junior prom in my high school. She was dating a guy that lived
Well,
across.
in her journal, she talks about first meeting you at church, and
Yeah.
you had the pointy shoes and the
Yeah,
crappy clothes, and so
well, yeah. Back
she said
then,
you looked like a
there were two
gangster kid.
There were two categories of kids. What was it? The kids that wore madras, which is like stripy clothes, and then the other guys that they call spics. And I was that. I had hair back then, and I had a lot of hair. It was black, and we combed it back, and we were tough guys. We never beat anybody up.
Yeah, she said you looked like a scary guy you'd meet in the alley.
Yeah, well, Bobby, his arms were huge, and we never lifted weights. I think that sort of comes from our background, and I was actually strong and stuff. I was on the track team, and I was a lifeguard all through my first job. I applied on my 16th birthday for this job as a lifeguard. And I was hoping I could get that job. Through scouting, I had gotten my Red Cross life-saving merit, which was the only requirement. And I went in and I said, he said, do you have your Red Cross? I said, yes, I do. And he said, how old are you? I said, 16. I could tell you this. He said, well, how old, are you much older than 16? I said, well, today's my birthday. He goes, oh, all right. He says, well, come to this meeting he says, come back on this date. And I didn't know if I was hired or not. I came back and I realized it was an orientation. He'd hired me, but he didn't say. He was just disgusted because I had just turned 16. But it was a great job, and so I did that. But Mom was dating this really. I remember in 1965 he had a '65 Mustang convertible. I mean, it was not only a Mustang; it was a convertible, and he was rich. He was good looking, but he was a couple years older than her. So when I was 16, he was 18, and he went to Arizona State University in Arizona from Connecticut, and that sort of ended it. And so I asked her if she wanted to go to the junior prom with me, and she said she would, and I was so nervous. I had to go to her mom's house, and I knew her mom didn't really like me.
Well, she said in her journal that she's like, when she first saw you at church,
Yeah.
she was kind of scared, and then she didn't
Yeah.
go to church for a while and started dating that guy for a while.
Yeah.
And then she said that her dad caught her sneaking in the window,
Yeah,
and he'd like put a string in the window to catch it.
to know if she opened
Yeah.
the window at night. Yeah.
And then he finally caught him, and he said, "You guys need to break up." And so they ended up breaking up, and then
Yeah.
she ended up going back to church, and then she saw you again after a few years, and
Oh,
she
I
said you
don't
had
remember
changed
that.
quite a bit. She's like, he was actually really good looking, and he didn't have slick back hair, pointy shoes.
Yeah, eventually I got out of that phase, and I decided I wanted to go to college, and school was always easy for me, believe it or not.
She said that then she saw you at you were doing the band or something.
Yeah.
And
So my people who turned out to be real good friends, Doug Anderson, who's now a bishop in Northbrook, Illinois, and a dentist there, and Wayne Jesperson, who's now living in Florida, and I were real good friends. We went to Scouts. We had sailboats. We used to sail around Long Island Sound. We did a lot of fun stuff. But those three, so Susan, Doug, and Wayne, were in a little folk band, and they played. And they were actually the opening act for a guy named Pete Seeger, and he was actually a pretty famous guy. And he was impressed with them, and Mom was a great guitarist and really good singer, and so was Doug and Wayne. Wayne was a better singer. But they had a folk band, and they
what
played.
did you do? The music or the
Well, they just asked me to be.
instruments?
Well, no, it was just kind of. They said, "Hey, can you keep the sound equalized?" And so it was an equalizer board, and I could figure stuff out. So I was there. She just said she looked down and she.
She fell in love with you.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Of course, it would have been information that would have been helpful if you would have told me.
So
But,
then
yeah.
you took her to the junior prom.
Junior prom, and I
Were
was
you
at
the prom?
Yeah, believe it or not, I was in the running. The guy that won was the star fullback of the team. But some of the other people came up, and I was actually surprised because I didn't nominate myself or whatever, but somehow I got nominated. I knew a lot of people, and I knew the people that weren't the popular kids, if that makes sense. I was good friends. Like, even one of the kids in my homeroom, Steve Berman and I, he lives in Vegas now. We're still good friends, and we were not we were just rabble. But I had a lot of friends, even at school. And even though I didn't go to any of their houses because I didn't want them coming to mine, but at school we were good friends. And so it turns out I was runner-up, and they said I just missed it by like not very many votes for being the junior prom king, which I was. I can't believe that. I'm surprised. But we went to the junior prom, and she had a good time, and we went home. And I remember this one incident that impressed her. She saw a black balloon that escaped, and it was jet black, and she was wearing a black dress, and she goes, well, I really like to have that black balloon, and kind of as a joke, but I took it as a challenge. And so there were balloons around, and this one had escaped and had gotten way up in the ceiling. And I figured out how to retrieve it. I got some other balloons, I attached some tape and got it to stick, and I figured if I did it hard enough and it hit hard enough, it would stick. And sure enough, it was not enough to pull it down, but it was enough to pull it off the apex of the ceiling down to a place where I could grab it and I could get the string, because it still had a long string. But she was impressed that I could figure that out, and then I would go through that much just because she, on a whim, said I would like to have that black balloon, and so we did that.
I've never heard that story.
Yeah, she'll remember that. But I was so happy I was able to do that. Yeah, there's still a picture. We have a picture of her that her mom took. It's still there, and she had it on the album. It's sort of faded now. It's got an oval shape, but that first picture of our first date we still had, and I was surprised that her mom even wanted to take a picture. But she was dressed up, and
I remember that picture.
yeah, I looked goofy. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Then after my mission, she wrote while I was in what was called the language training mission, the LTM. Mm-hmm. As soon as I left the country, she quit writing. So I came back. I had no idea if she was married, had kids. I didn't know. I finally got up the courage to ask my mom. I said, well, is Susan still around? She goes, well, I've seen her. She's in church. So I called her up and I went over. And I bought a car. I saved enough money. By the way, I worked as a newspaper delivery kid at age 12. I worked for a kid named Vinny DiTillo for the summer for free. I did all of his deliveries for free, and then I got the right to own his paper route. Mm. And so then I had his paper route, and then there was a guy named Mr. Robinson who was the circulation manager, and he says, look, we got a morning. The Bridgeport Post was the afternoon paper. The morning was called the Tribune. And he said, I have like 23 customers, but I need a paper boy. Can you do both? And so Bobby and I did it. And the paper truck would come at 3 o'clock in the morning and dump the paper off. And we would go deliver papers like at 3:30 in the morning. The truck would wake us up. We would always get up and then deliver those papers.
Even during the school year?
Oh, yeah, all year long.
Did you go back to bed after?
Yeah, we went right back to bed. We were on our bicycles. Back then you got them, you had green elastics, and you'd chuck them, just chuck them at the front door or on the front porch. But we were really good at it. And I had a bicycle that had paper rack holders. They were like saddlebags for the big. Wednesday was always a big, huge paper day because they had all the ads. And so Wednesday was like, sometimes I'd have to go twice because it wouldn't all fit. But Bobby and I both did those paper routes. And actually, the way it worked out is eventually Bobby just did the morning one and I just did the afternoon one because he didn't want to do the afternoon
You're getting
one.
sidetracked.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We were talking about mom.
Oh, sorry. So let's see. That was our
So
first
after
date.
your mission,
After our mission, I went over. I had $600. I had saved $1,000 from 12 to 14.
Whoa.
$2,000 at age 16. I had $4,000 saved by the time I graduated from high school.
that's a
To
lot.
put that in
back
perspective,
then, yeah.
you could buy I remember I looked at a Chevy Impala, which is a full-size car. It was $3,000. So that was a lot of money. And so I paid for my first year all at BYU. I went to stayed on campus, Hinckley Hall, and paid for food, boarding, everything else, the airfare. Paid for all my mission. Came back and I still had money enough for a year of college still. And I bought a car. I remember I paid $650 for an MGB, a little sports car. And I was just in love with this. And Bobby was looking at it. And he was a good. Matter of fact, in high school, Bobby, they had a contest where they went back and they purposely disabled things on the vehicle, and they had everybody go. It was the same thing on all the cars, and they had to see who could diagnose it and fix it the fastest, and Bobby won the contest. He was a good car mechanic. They offered him a scholarship, and he goes, I don't want to work on other people's cars. So he went to Connecticut School of Electronics and graduated. Anyway, I bought this car. Bobby said, it was a pile. I shouldn't have driven it. And I should have known, too, when I was driving it, as you went around the corner, the passenger door wouldn't stay shut. It would just go flying open. None of the electrical, the brake lights and the things didn't work. But Bobby he helped fix it all up. But after I found out Susan was there, Bobby helped fix it up. I went to go on a date with Susan. And I went to their home. It was on Galt Park Drive, 3 Galt Park Drive in Westport. When I drove up, I decided to back the car in because my side was like all wavy and it didn't have the molding. There's like a stainless steel pinstriping that went down. It was perfect on her side. It was a little convertible. So I backed, and they had a long driveway. They had a pretty nice house. And I'm backing all the way up. And Susan told me that her mom said, Lordy, Lordy, what's wrong with that boy? He's backing
Picture
in.
grandma saying that.
Yeah. The other thing I did, because the seats were all cracked, they were leather seats, they were cracked, but I had gotten on my mission these sheepskin things, saddle blankets. They're really thick, white, beautiful white. I thought it was fun. It made the seats nice and soft. Susan thought they were horrible. But anyway, I backed up. We had our first date, and I remember when she first went to say hi, she grabbed my arm and say hi, and I was still fresh off my mission. I think, I can't touch girls. I remember that. And anyway, I had to go to school immediately. If I didn't go to school within 2 weeks, I'd have been drafted and bound up in Vietnam. But I went from a missionary deferment. You got a deferment if you're on a mission. You got a deferment if you're a full-time student. So I immediately left, and eventually she came to BYU. She had been going to Boston to LaSalle College. And eventually we did that. And we got married on the last day of my graduation, on the day I still had finals. So we kind of got engaged off and on all, sophomore, junior, senior year. I'd ask her to marry. She said yes, her mom would talk her out of it. And that went on for 3 years until finally, in the last day, I said, well, I got a job. I had a job in Norwalk, Connecticut with a CPA firm. And I said, I'm going, if you're coming. And so that finally, I think, put her over the edge. We got married. Got married on December 19th. And I remember I went back because we were going to have a wedding reception, plus I had a job. I went back to the wedding reception. She stayed with Grandma Jean. So we got married and immediately we split. She stayed here in Utah. I went back to Connecticut, and then she came out, and we lived back in Connecticut for a little bit of time. I still had a job as a waiter in a restaurant, and made even more money. I made fabulous money there, and I was going to stay, and not. Oh, it turns out I was one quarter of one credit hour short to graduate, but then a job opened up to be a waiter full time at this restaurant, and I was making more money there than I thought I'd make as an accountant in a CPA firm. I was, and so I was going to stay. And then one day the bishop said, "No, you better go finish up your schooling," and I took that as okay. If that's what my ordained leader says to do, I'll do it. So we got up and left and went, and then but CPA firms only hire once a year, and so I wound up working here in Utah, but not for a CPA firm. And I eventually got my CPA, and we lived out here, and that.
And you stayed out here ever since.
Yeah, we stayed. I like to say I stayed for lunch after that. But
I think that's a good ending spot. What do you think?
Is it?